Mr. Terence Stevens, a wealthy and influential magnate in the tech industry, was a man of immense power and quiet ambition. He had two sons, Marlon and Patrick, raised in the same sprawling estate, treated with equal affection, and given the same elite education. Yet, despite their identical beginnings, they blossomed into strikingly different men. Marlon, the elder, inherited his father's sharp business acumen, and by his early 30s he was already a renowned entrepreneur at the helm of a thriving software company. He moved with the confident stride of a man who knew precisely what he wanted. Patrick, however, was a different sort of soul, quiet, contemplative, and gentle. He yearned for a life far removed from the city's ceaseless hum. The moment he turned 18, he packed his bags and left for a small idyllic rural town he had dreamed of since childhood, a place where the air smelled of pine and damp earth. Terence had tried desperately to dissuade him. "Patrick, my boy, why on earth would you bury yourself out there?" Terence had pleaded, his voice laced with a mixture of confusion and disappointment. "Look at Marlon, how quickly he's rising, building an empire. You're just as capable, if not more so. Get into business. I'll give you the perfect start. Why waste your potential in the middle of nowhere?" He simply couldn't comprehend his younger son's choices, the son he secretly, perhaps even unfairly, loved with a deeper, more tender affection than Marlon. But Patrick wouldn't hear a word of it. "No, Dad, please, understand. This isn't burying myself. I've always wanted to live in the countryside. The city's rush, the endless noise, it's not for me. I dream of cultivating organic vegetables, nourishing people with fresh, wholesome produce. What's so wrong with that? I'll build my own farm, you'll see, and I don't need any start-up capital from you." His quiet determination was as unyielding as an old oak tree. Realizing his youngest son could not be swayed from his chosen path, Arthur, a sigh escaping his lips, finally waved a resigned hand. He had enough of his own sprawling business concerns to manage. Realizing his youngest son could not be swayed from his chosen path, Terence, a sigh escaping his lips, finally waved a resigned hand. He had enough of his own sprawling business concerns to manage. From that day forward, their meetings became rare, fleeting moments across a vast emotional distance. As for the brothers, they drifted almost entirely apart. Marlon's life was a whirlwind of high-stakes deals, lavish parties, and dizzying wealth. Patrick's was one of quiet labour, the serene hum of the countryside, and soon the tender joys of a wife and child. It was no surprise, then, that years passed without the brothers seeing each other. There simply wasn't time, nor did it seem there was anything left to say. Their reunion, after half a decade of unspoken distance, was brought about by the most sombre of occasions, their father's funeral. Mr. Terence Stevens had passed away suddenly, a heart attack robbing them of their patriarch. The brothers embraced awkwardly, murmured condolences for their shared loss, but still there was little to truly discuss. They hadn't gathered for conversation. The real discussion began after the reception. Once the formal condolences were done, Marlon, ever the direct one, wasted no time. "Well, Patrick, here we are. Orphans now. And, you know, Dad didn't leave a will." "Yes, I heard," Patrick replied, a slight frown creasing his brow. "I suppose he thought it wasn't necessary. After all, it's just the two of us." He looked around the hushed room, noting the absence of other close relatives. Their mother had passed years ago, and there were no other siblings. "That's true enough," Marlon conceded, pacing the opulent living room, his hands clasped behind his back. "But I think this might not be settled without a court battle. I'm quite sure Dad intended the lion's share to go to me." He paused, catching Patrick's surprised gaze. "Oh, don't look so shocked. Of course, I'll share with you. Some portions will be yours, but forgive me, it won't be a large one. You are the younger brother, after all. Maybe 10%? Or fine, 20, he conceded with a dismissive wave. "It's still an enormous sum, regardless. You don't need much, I gather, living out there." His tone, though still outwardly friendly, was starting to curdle. Patrick's brows knitted. "Interesting. What exactly do you mean by enormous, then? And how much would be left for you?" "What does it matter how much?" Marlon scoffed, his voice sharpening like a knife's edge. "You don't want the business, do you? And you said you didn't need any start-up capital, so what's the big deal? I followed in Dad's footsteps. You chose to wander off, live in the wilderness, commune with nature. Why would you need all that money?" Marlon's voice was now hard, edged with contempt. "Actually, this is Dad's inheritance, and I'm not asking you for anything. And I don't believe I owe you an explanation for what I need it for," Patrick retorted, his own quiet anger beginning to simmer. "I do need it. My child is ill and I have a family, and besides, by rights, everything should be divided equally. That's only fair." "Oh, please don't make me laugh," Marlon scoffed, waving away Patrick's words as if swatting a fly. "Fairness? I understand you have a child, but that's a child, and strictly speaking, not even our father's biological grandchild. And honestly, I think you'll have more than enough for your child's treatment anyway. You said you didn't need money, but if you insist on fighting for what you think is yours, out of principle, then I stand by what I said. We'll see each other in court." These words, delivered with a chilling finality, deeply wounded Patrick. He ended the unpleasant conversation swiftly, then left the reception entirely, citing his wife and child waiting for him back in the village. Some of those who had overheard the exchange were taken aback. One relative, a kindly old aunt, even approached Marlon. "Aren't you being too harsh on your own brother, Marlon?" "Oh, please, Aunt Martha, spare me," Marlon replied, his voice laced with irritation, his patience clearly at an end. "What more tenderness does he need? Didn't he himself abandon father, run off to that village against Dad's wishes, and flat out refuse to get involved in the family business? He chose his own path entirely, decided he wanted to drown the whole world in his honey. And what did it get him? A failed business venture, a marriage he never even told Dad about, never asked for advice, and then, to top it all off, he couldn't even have his own child. And now he's adopted some sickly kid who knows what's wrong with him, and expects my father's money to pay for it. Is that fair, in your opinion?" Perhaps father, being a man who took money very seriously, didn't write a will precisely because he intended everything to go to me. There was little to argue against, and indeed no one tried to contradict him. Patrick meanwhile drove home, the weight of his brother's cruel words pressing down on him, his mind consumed with what to do next. Would he truly have to sue his own brother? Patrick recoiled from the thought. The very idea of endless court appearances, the bitter legal wrangling, sent a shiver down his spine. Besides, he barely had a moment to spare. He and Gianna truly did have a sick child, Max, not their biological son, but a boy they'd adopted from the local children's home. Patrick loved Max with a fierceness that transcended blood, and he had even named him after his own father, a tender gesture of connection. The problem was Max wasn't entirely healthy. At first, doctors had dismissed their concerns, saying it was nothing serious, easily fixable. But recently they'd managed to get Max an appointment with a new, rather renowned paediatrician in the city. The news from that visit had been a devastating blow. The problem was far more serious than they had initially believed, requiring specialized and expensive treatment. This revelation had profoundly affected Gianna, and, as Patrick suspected with a growing knot of dread, it wasn't because she was worried for their son. He suspected she was simply disappointed, perhaps even regretting their choice to adopt Max from the orphanage. So when Patrick returned home from his father's funeral, he recounted to Gianna the cold, hard conversation about the inheritance. Gianna gasped, clutching her head drastically. Her usual composed features contorted into a mask of anger and despair. "So your brother wants to disinherit us? To cut us off completely?" "Well, not completely." Patrick tried to soothe her, his voice weary. "He said he'd still have to give us something, maybe 10 or 20%. "How can you be so naive?" Gianna's voice rose, sharp as a thorny bush. "We don't need his paltry handouts. We need everything. At least enough for Max's treatment, and so much more. How many times have I told you, Patrick, I'm sick of living like a peasant, like a forgotten serf tied to this dusty land?" Her words poured out, a torrent of long-held resentments. "If we get that inheritance, we could finally move to the city, live a decent life. Live a decent life? No worse than your brother, who flits from one high-end club to another, dining at exclusive restaurants, jet-setting to glamorous resorts, while we're out here shoveling manure and wrestling with these stupid bees." Gianna couldn't calm herself, her face flushed, her hands gesticulating wildly. "Gianna, what are you saying?" Patrick stared at her, genuinely shocked. "You knew perfectly well how we'd live when you married me. You said you loved this life. Now you're suddenly discontent?" "Discontent?" Her laugh was brittle, devoid of humour. "And I should be content. Tell me, Patrick, what exactly should I be happy about? The prospect of spending my entire life buried in the sticks? Or the constant burden of a sick child? Or perhaps the fact that I'll never be able to walk down a proper street in decent clothes and shoes, always trudging through mud in these awful rubber boots?" She waved a muddy boot in the air, as if it were a symbol of her eternal damnation. If you think this is a wonderful life, I'm thrilled for you." Gianna spat, her voice dripping with indignation. Patrick watched her, a horrifying realization dawning on him. Had he been so wrong? Had she merely been pretending all this time, playing the part of the loving wife and then the devoted mother? It certainly seemed that way now. Learning that the inheritance might slip through their fingers, Gianna's anger festered with each passing day. She lashed out at him constantly, her words like tiny stinging wasps, and finally declared that she wanted a divorce. Patrick, utterly exhausted by her relentless complaints and chilling lack of empathy, offered no resistance. Max, who had just turned 6, sensed the heavy, unsettling shift in the atmosphere between his parents, but he was too young to mediate, and Gianna, with a cold, mocking smirk, delivered her final blow. "You're the one who wanted a child, Patrick. You treat him yourself. I wash my hands of it." With that, she gathered her things, not many, given her complaints about their simple life, and left, slamming the door on a marriage that had already died. When Max woke up and learned his mother was gone, he cried for a little while, a soft, heartbroken sound that twisted Patrick's gut. Then he looked up, his big, innocent eyes questioning. "Mama's not coming back at all?" "I don't know, Max," Patrick whispered, pulling his son into a tight hug. "Maybe she will, but if she doesn't, I'll always be with you, I promise." The boy loved Gianna, had called her Mama since he could speak, but lately she hadn't paid him much attention, her warmth having noticeably cooled. Left alone with his son and the demanding farm, Patrick could no longer manage trips to the city. He had no idea what his brother's legal plans were. He could only cling to the faint hope that the court would somehow be fair. Marlon wasted no time. He was already preparing, consulting with high-powered lawyers, and doing everything possible to win the case. At one point, he even entertained the thought of forging a will, claiming he'd found it by accident, but ultimately decided against it, fearing the legal repercussions. His lawyer, a slick, confident woman named Ms. Caldwell, assured him that victory was in any case guaranteed. "Defeating Patrick will be effortless," Ms. Caldwell had stated with a confident smirk, but Marlon still harboured a strange, lingering doubt. His brother hadn't resurfaced, hadn't made any demands. Too quiet. Perhaps Patrick was planning something. Marlon decided to send a spy, someone to gauge his younger brother's plans and vulnerabilities. For this purpose, he chose Ruby, a young woman down on her luck who sometimes worked odd jobs as a cleaner on his vast estate. Marlon summoned her to his sleek, minimalist office. "Ruby," he began, his voice devoid of warmth, "I have a task for you, a simple one, but it requires discretion. My brother Patrick lives in that rustic little farm town. I need you to go there, gain his trust, and find out what he's planning, what his strategy is for this inheritance. The bigger the secrets you uncover, the more you'll be compensated." He named a sum that made Ruby's eyes widen, a sum that could pull her out of her desperate situation. "What if he doesn't let me in?" she asked, surprised, her voice barely a whisper. Marlon's smile was thin, mirthless. "Make him let you in. You're resourceful, aren't you? Cry if you have to. Tell him you have nowhere to live, nothing to eat. Tell him you can be a farmhand, a housekeeper, anything. You're strong, you can handle anything, right?" He handed her an address scribbled on a small card. "This is where you'll be working." Ruby, desperate and with limited options, agreed. One chilly autumn morning, she stood on Patrick's porch, the weight of her deception heavy in her chest, and knocked. Patrick, left to manage the demanding farm and a heartbroken child all by himself, was utterly overwhelmed, running on fumes. He listened to her tearful, pitiful story of homelessness and hunger, his own innate kindness overriding any caution. Without much thought, he allowed her to stay. Ruby felt a prick of guilt. The task Marlon had assigned her to spy on this kind, gentle man and his sweet little boy Max was not sitting well with her. Patrick, meanwhile, was simply grateful to finally have some help in their now quiet, often lonely home. Ruby proved to be an invaluable presence in their small, often chaotic farmhouse. She was remarkably capable, a whirlwind of quiet efficiency. She watched over Max with genuine affection, kept the farmhouse impeccably tidy, conjured hearty, comforting meals from their simple pantry, and generally brought a soothing order to their lives. Evenings became the highlight of Patrick's day, a quiet ritual when Ruby would serve him dinner, her presence a balm after long hours of solitary labour. He found himself opening up to her, sharing the painful story of Gianna's sudden departure, and the crushing weight of his brother Marlon's attempt to strip him of his inheritance. As Patrick recounted his woes, Ruby felt a tightening knot of discomfort in her stomach. The contrast between Marlon's cold ambition and Patrick's simple, honest goodness was stark, and her obligation to spy and report back grew increasingly distasteful. She was caught between a rock and a hard place, as the saying goes. But on the other hand, she had made a promise to Marlon, and in her world a promise meant a job, a way to survive. Still, the guilt gnawed at her. She began finding excuses, small acts of rebellion. During her long conversations with Patrick, she would sometimes simply switch off the voice recorder on her phone, feigning technical glitches when Marlon called for updates. "My phone's been acting up, Mr. Stevens," she'd explain, a practised innocence in her voice. Patrick, of course, suspected nothing. He was far too honourable, too preoccupied to even conceive that his own brother would resort to such underhanded tactics. His primary concern, a heavy cloud that followed him everywhere, was Max's health. Patrick had begun to harbour deep doubts about the qualifications of the doctor who had initially seemed so trustworthy. Now, with each follow-up visit, the doctor found signs of new, ever more alarming ailments in Max, describing them with a chilling detachment, as if his sole purpose was to terrify Patrick, to plunge him deeper into despair. But the doctor achieved the opposite effect entirely. Instead of succumbing to fear, Patrick's quiet determination solidified into a stubborn resolve. He began to question all these increasingly dire diagnoses, the doctor's gloomy pronouncements, and decided, with a surge of renewed hope, to seek a second opinion. One crisp autumn morning he dressed Max carefully, packed a small bag and set off for the city, heading towards a renowned children's hospital. Meanwhile, back at the quiet farmhouse, as Patrick was tackling his urgent medical quest, Ruby's phone buzzed. It was Marlon. "Ruby?" Marlon's voice crackled through the receiver, as formal and unyielding as ever. "Come to my office. Now. We need to talk." "Right now?" Ruby stammered, glancing around the empty house. "But Patrick isn't here, and I didn't tell him I was leaving." She started to protest, but Marlon, a man who tolerated no objections, cut her off with an impatient sigh. "Come immediately and bring all your recordings." "I can just send them to you, Mr. Stevens," Ruby tried, her voice a little too defiant. "Let's not argue, shall we?" Marlon's voice grew colder, sharp as ice. "I said you need to come now. I'm interested not only in the recordings, but also in certain questions that need to be discussed face to face. Don't waste my time." Ruby had no choice. With a heavy heart, she made the journey, first calling Patrick with some flimsy excuse about an urgent errand in town. The deception tasted bitter in her mouth. She had grown genuinely attached to both Patrick and little Max, their kindness a stark contrast to the cutthroat world she had inhabited. She couldn't even begin to imagine Patrick's face if he ever discovered that her presence in their home was not an accident, but a calculated betrayal. When she arrived at Marlon's opulent office, the air conditioning chilling her skin even indoors, she handed over the recordings and dutifully recounted everything she had learned about Patrick's affairs. As she turned to leave, her task complete, she almost collided with a man stepping into the doorway. It was the doctor who had been treating Max, the very one who had delivered such disheartening news. Ruby mumbled a hasty greeting, but the doctor, a portly man with detached eyes, didn't even acknowledge her, perhaps not recognising her outside the context of Patrick's farm. He merely swept past her, heading directly into Marlon's office. Ruby, gripped by a sudden inexplicable impulse, didn't leave. Instead, she lingered by the door, her ear pressed subtly against the polished wood, an unbidden urge to listen compelling her. What if their conversation concerned Max's health? "Well, how are things progressing?" Marlon asked, his voice unexpectedly warm, a stark contrast to the frosty tone he'd used with Ruby just moments before. The doctor's voice was smooth, confident. "Everything is proceeding exactly as planned. No one has noticed any discrepancies in the medical record I've provided. Your brother is still frantically rushing his son from one specialist to another, and they're all believing what I've written in the reports. So rest assured, for the foreseeable future, he'll be completely preoccupied. No time for inheritance battles, no time for court, no time for anything but treating his little boy for non-existent illnesses. And by the time he finally realises what's happening, Mr. Stevens, you'll have already won everything." A cold dread seeped through Ruby's bones, chilling her to the core. Non-existent illnesses. Max wasn't truly sick. The sheer cruelty of it made her gasp silently. With a newfound burst of fury and righteous indignation, Ruby quietly slipped away from the door, a phantom in the hushed hallway. She practically flew down the stairs and raced back to the train station, desperate to get back to the farm. Now, she had no intention of keeping anything hidden. She was absolutely certain Patrick would be overjoyed, relieved beyond measure by what she had overheard. Ruby herself felt an immense, soaring relief. It meant Max wasn't nearly as sick as the doctor had claimed, and it was entirely possible he could be cured without those terrifying costly surgeries and procedures that were draining Patrick's time, money and spirit. Yes, confessing her deception would be humiliating, a bitter pill to swallow, but she desperately hoped that the sheer joy of the news, the truth about Max's health, would prevent Patrick from truly, deeply getting angry at her. Perhaps he would even forgive her. The weather, ironically, was glorious. The crisp autumn air was clean, the sun shining brightly. She practically leaped onto the commuter train at the last minute, so she didn't even have to wait long for the next one. The train car was blessedly empty, quiet. Unfortunately, that's where her luck ran out. A few shady characters loitering at the far end of the car noticed her. They were rough-looking, their eyes narrowing. It seemed her radiant, hopeful face, her sheer elation, had attracted their attention. They must have thought that someone in such high spirits surely had something valuable in her handbag, perhaps a recent windfall. Perhaps if she had just given them her meagre belongings, it would have ended there. But Ruby, fueled by her recent revelation and a surge of new determination, decided to stand her ground. She fought back, fiercely, desperately. As a result, the thugs beat her viciously and then, with shocking brutality, threw her from the moving train into the darkness of the tracks. Meanwhile, back at the farmhouse, Patrick had returned home to an empty house. He found a hastily scrawled note from Ruby, explaining some urgent errands in the city and promising a swift return. At first he waited calmly, going about his chores, his heart a little lighter for the brief reprieve she offered. But when she didn't return by evening, a prickle of worry began to nag at him, and when the night passed with no sign of her, he came to a painful, familiar conclusion. She had left him too, just like Gianna. Yes, this was to be expected, he thought sadly, staring out at the moonlit fields, a profound loneliness settling over him. She's a young woman, pretty, full of life. Why would she want to sit around here in the middle of nowhere with a simpleton like me, a man who couldn't even bring himself to say a kind word to her, let alone with a sick child? She probably went to find her own happiness, and God bless her for it. He sighed, a heavy, mournful sound, the words a silent poem in his mind. Ah, Ruby, my wild rose. Only now, in the chilling silence of her absence, did Patrick fully grasp how deeply Ruby had burrowed into his heart. He spent several days in a fog of longing, convinced he had lost her forever, when a hesitant knock echoed through the quiet farmhouse. Patrick's heart leaped. He practically stumbled to the door, a desperate hope blooming in his chest that she had against all odds returned. But standing on the threshold was a kind, unfamiliar older man. "Good morning," the man said, his voice gruff but gentle. "My name is Nicholas. I'm a park ranger. Are you Patrick?" "Yes, I am," Patrick replied, a wave of confusion washing over him. Nicholas nodded, his gaze compassionate. "Well, I found a young woman near the train tracks. She'd been badly beaten. Looks like she was thrown from the moving train. Her name's Ruby." "Where is she? What happened to her? Is she alive?" Patrick gasped, his voice cracking with sudden terror. "Why didn't she come herself?" "She can't yet," Nicholas explained, his voice low. "She's at St. Jude's Hospital. Needs to rest, but she desperately asked me to find you. Said she had an important message for you, if I could bring you to her." Patrick didn't hesitate. He raced to the hospital, his mind a whirlwind of fear and a desperate prayer that Ruby would be all right. There, in the sterile quiet of her hospital room, her face bruised but her eyes clear and resolute, she told him everything. Every word of Marlon's cruel plot, every detail of the doctor's wicked deception, and the shocking, glorious truth about Max's health. "So that's it," Patrick whispered, stunned, the words barely escaping his lips. His brother's monstrous betrayal was a bitter pill to swallow, a fresh wound to his heart. But the revelation that Max's illness was a fabrication, that their son could in fact be healed far more easily and less expensively than he had been led to believe, that news was like a sunrise after a long, dark night. And the knowledge that Ruby, despite her ordeal, would recover, with no serious permanent injuries, was a profound relief. Patrick took her hand, his thumb gently stroking her bruised knuckles. "You know, Ruby," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion, his gaze locked with hers. "When I thought you'd left for good, I was terrified. I realized I love you." A faint, tender smile touched Ruby's swollen lips. She reached up, her fingers lightly caressing his cheek. "And what do you think I feel, Patrick?" she whispered back, her eyes shining with unshed tears. But for Patrick, the immediate priority wasn't just his personal happiness. It was the looming court battle with his brother. Now, however, he would walk into that courtroom prepared, armed with the devastating truth of Marlon's deceit. And so it happened. The truth, ugly and undeniable, came out. The judge, hearing Ruby's tearful testimony and seeing the corroborating evidence, had no choice. In the end, the inheritance was legally divided equally between both sons, a ruling based on pure justice. Marlon was furious, his face a mask of bitter resentment, but there was no arguing with the law. He had pressing matters of his own to contend with. While Marlon had been consumed with his schemes to swindle his brother, his own thriving tech empire had begun to crumble, neglected as he pursued his petty vendetta. He had failed to monitor his company's operations, ignored warnings, and now the vast majority of his inherited money, which he had so desperately coveted, was swallowed up by the urgent need to rectify the company's precarious financial position, a desperate attempt to stave off ruin. Patrick, on the other hand, fully immersed himself in Max's treatment. True to Ruby's overheard conversation, the path to recovery proved to be far simpler and significantly less costly than the conniving doctor had claimed. Max's bright spirit returned, and his laughter once again filled the farmhouse. Patrick hadn't forgotten the heartfelt confession he'd made to Ruby in her hospital room. Soon after her recovery, they married in a small, joyful ceremony in their garden, surrounded by their closest friends and neighbours. Together they ran the farm, their hands intertwined not just in work, but in shared purpose and deep affection, raising Max in a home brimming with love and honesty. Then, one sun-drenched afternoon, completely unexpectedly, Gianna appeared on their doorstep. She had not found the happiness she had so desperately sought in the city, her superficial dreams turning to dust. Now, clinging to a desperate hope, she had returned, convinced that her husband and child would welcome her back with open arms, overjoyed at her return. But Patrick didn't even allow her inside. "I'm sorry, Gianna," he said, his voice calm but unyielding, a quiet strength in his eyes. "But we don't need you any more. We have a different life now." "What do you mean, we?" Gianna scoffed, her eyes narrowing, her old acrimony resurfacing. "You only speak for yourself. Ask your son." She spotted Max emerging from the living room, drawn by the sound of voices, and rushed towards him, her arms outstretched. "Darling, don't you recognise me? It's Mama." "No, my Mama is right here," Max replied, his small voice clear and firm, pointing directly at Ruby. He then turned his back on the woman who had abandoned him, retreating into the farmhouse. Gianna stood there, stunned, the realization dawning that she had truly lost everything. In the end, she had no choice but to leave, empty-handed, disappearing back into the lonely city life she had created for herself. This sad story, though, yielded a far warmer, more heartfelt reunion for the brothers. A few months later, a humbled Marlon, his once proud business now barely a shadow of its former glory, arrived at Patrick's farm. He had come to visit his younger brother, to congratulate him on finding such profound family happiness, and to ask for forgiveness. "I understand, Patrick," he said, his voice surprisingly soft, a vulnerability in his eyes Patrick had never seen. "I know I wronged you deeply, and little Max too, but I couldn't not come. You're all I have left, my closest family." Patrick understood. He felt it too. Despite everything, they were still brothers, still connected by blood and a shared history, the closest people they had left in the world. He simply nodded, a quiet forgiveness in his eyes.